The sound of iron wheels screeching against steel rails filled the air as the train came to a halt. The cattle cars, overcrowded with men, women, and children, opened to a rush of cold wind and barking orders. For many, this was the first breath of fresh air in days, but it brought no relief, only dread. The stench of fear mingled with smoke, drifting from chimneys in the distance. No one needed to be told what that smoke meant. Rumors had traveled faster than the trains. Prisoners stumbled out onto the platform under the glaring lights. SS guards in black uniforms stood like statues of authority, their dogs straining on leashes, teeth bared. Commands were shouted in harsh German. Raus, schnell, move. The newly arrived were pushed into lines, separated by gender, men to one side, women and children to another. Mothers tried to hold on to their sons, fathers clung to their daughters, but the separation was swift and brutal. Tears and cries filled the night, swallowed by the chilling efficiency of the process. It was called selection. To the prisoners, it felt like a judgment without trial. An SS officer, often with a casual flick of the wrist, decided who was fit to work and who would die immediately. The elderly, the sick, pregnant women, and children were often sent straight to their deaths. They didn't know it yet. Some believed they were heading to showers after a long journey. Others sensed the truth, but kept silent, hoping to shield their loved ones from panic. Those deemed strong enough were ordered to form another line. Their nightmare was just beginning. The march to the camp gates was short, but unforgettable. Above the entrance, a phrase mocked their suffering. Arbeit macht frei. Work sets you free. For those who understood German, the words stung with cruel irony. Inside, barbed wire fences loomed high, electrified and lethal. Guard towers overlooked every inch of the grounds. There was no escape, only survival, if you were lucky. The first stop was the processing area. Here, names ceased to matter. Identities were stripped away with cold precision. Prisoners were ordered to undress completely, standing naked in front of strangers. Hair was shaved off, both from the head and body, not only to humiliate, but also to prevent lice. The clothes they had worn, the last remnants of normal life, were thrown into piles, never to be seen again. Then came the tattoo. At Auschwitz and a few other camps, a series of numbers was inked into the skin, usually on the forearm. This was not just a mark, it was a sentence. The person became a number in a system designed to erase humanity. When guards spoke, they rarely used names, only numbers. From that moment on, the individual ceased to exist in the eyes of the regime. They were property of the Third Reich. Prison uniforms were issued, rough, striped garments, often infested with lice. The fabric was thin, offering little protection against the freezing winters or the scorching summers. Shoes, when provided, were often wooden clogs that blistered the feet. Many prisoners received mismatched sizes or shoes with holes, forcing them to march and work with bleeding soles. For women, humiliation continued with medical examinations that were invasive and degrading. Men and women alike were forced to stand for hours without food or water during these procedures. Disease spread easily in these crowded, unsanitary spaces. Tuberculosis, typhus, and dysentery thrived. The camp was not just a prison, it was a machine built to destroy the body and crush the soul. After processing, the new prisoners were herded into the barracks. Wooden huts, damp and overcrowded, awaited them. The stench of sweat, waste, and sickness clung to the air. There were no beds, only wooden planks stacked in tiers, sometimes with straw that was rarely changed. Blankets were scarce, sometimes 6 to 8 people shared one. The weak huddled together for warmth, but many froze to death during the night. Hunger began immediately. The first meal was usually a watery soup with floating bits of turnip or cabbage. Sometimes it was just hot water colored brown and called coffee. Bread, if given, was black and hard, often mixed with sawdust to make it heavier. This was all the food prisoners would have for an entire day, a ration so small it guaranteed slow starvation. The cruelty was systematic. Starved bodies were easier to control, easier to break. Sleep offered no refuge. Nights were filled with the cries of the sick, the sound of boots on gravel during roll calls, and the ever-present fear of what tomorrow would bring. For many, the first night felt endless. Some whispered prayers in the darkness, clinging to faith as their last possession. Others stared silently into the void, knowing that survival was now a matter of chance. By the time the morning bell rang for the first roll call, one truth was clear. The camp was not just a prison, it was a world of its own, a world designed to erase dignity, hope, and life itself. Morning in a concentration camp did not begin with the sunrise. It began with the sharp blast of a whistle, the sound tearing through the freezing air like a knife. Prisoners scrambled from their wooden bunks, half asleep, their bodies aching from the cold and the hard planks they called a bed. There was no time to stretch or adjust. Guards shouted, dogs barked, and the chaos of roll call began. Roll call, or appel, was not a simple head count. It was a ritual of control, humiliation, and suffering. Prisoners were forced to stand in rigid rows, often for hours regardless of the weather. Snowstorms, pouring rain, burning sun, it made no difference. If one person was missing or an error was found in the count, the entire group might be punished by standing longer, sometimes until people collapsed from exhaustion. Dead bodies were not removed during these counts. They were kept propped up by the living because the numbers had to match. After roll call came a meager breakfast, if it could be called that. A small piece of dark, stale bread, sometimes moldy, was shared among prisoners, accompanied by a black liquid referred to as coffee, though it contained no coffee beans at all. For many, this was the only food they would see until evening. Then, the march to labor began. Work in the camps was designed not only for utility, but for destruction. Prisoners were sent to quarries, construction sites, munitions factories, or fields, performing back-breaking tasks for up to 12 hours a day. Malnutrition, disease, and exhaustion made even the simplest work unbearable. Tasks were deliberately harsh and often pointless, carrying heavy stones from one side of a yard to another, only to move them back again the next day. This was called extermination through labor. Tools were primitive and accidents were common. Those who faltered risked beatings or death on the spot. SS guards and capos, prisoners assigned as overseers, used whips, rifle butts, and sticks without hesitation. One slip, one moment of weakness, could mean a blow to the head or a bullet in the back. The ground was often littered with the bodies of those who couldn't keep pace. By midday, hunger gnawed like an animal inside the stomach. Lunch, if it came, was usually a thin soup made from turnips, cabbage, or potato peels, ingredients unfit even for livestock. The watery liquid offered little nutrition, but gave prisoners just enough strength to continue working, prolonging the agony of survival. People fought over scraps, drank water from filthy puddles, and scavenged rotten vegetable peels from the ground. Starvation drove some to desperate acts, even stealing from one another, a crime often punished by death. The physical strain was only part of the torment. Brutality was constant and deliberate. Guards amused themselves by inflicting pain, beating prisoners without reason, or ordering them to perform impossible tasks. Some forced prisoners to kneel on gravel for hours. Others ordered naked men and women to run laps in the snow. Dogs were trained to attack on command, ripping flesh while guards laughed. Evenings brought no relief. After another long roll call, often as punishing as the mornings, the prisoners returned to their barracks, dragging their broken bodies. Dinner was barely more than lunch, a slice of bread, maybe a spoon of margarine, or a smear of rancid sausage, if they were lucky. Fights over crumbs broke out, but most were too weak to resist. The calorie intake was so low that bodies wasted away rapidly. Within weeks, strong men became skeletons. Women looked decades older than their age. Disease spread unchecked. Typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis claimed countless lives. The latrines were open pits, so swarming with insects, and often overflowed into living spaces. Washing was nearly impossible. Water was scarce, and soap was a luxury few ever saw. The smell of unwashed bodies, sickness, and death filled the air. Lice crawled everywhere, on clothes, in hair, in bedding. Infection was inevitable. A small cut could become fatal. Sleep was another cruel joke. Barracks crammed hundreds into spaces meant for dozens. Wooden bunks were stacked in 3 tiers, each crowded with 5 or 6 people pressed together like sardines. Blankets were few, cold seeped through the thin walls, gnawing at bones. The night was pierced by coughs, moans, and sometimes screams of pain, of nightmares, of someone being dragged away for punishment. Rats scurried in the darkness, feeding on scraps and at times on the dead. What broke many prisoners was not just hunger or exhaustion, but the constant fear. Fear of random selections for execution, fear of beatings, fear of the next day. Hope became dangerous. It made the pain sharper. For some, survival meant shutting down emotionally, becoming numb to the horrors around them. For others, small acts of humanity, sharing a crust of bread, whispering a prayer, kept the flame of life alive. In the camps, every day was a battle, not just for the body, but for the soul. And as the days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, one question haunted every prisoner. How much longer can I endure this hell? As weeks turned into months, the concentration camp revealed its true purpose, not just to kill the body, but to destroy the soul. Every aspect of life was designed to erase individuality and crush any remaining sense of dignity. In the eyes of the guards and the Nazi regime, prisoners were no longer human. They were numbers, objects, tools to be worked until they broke. The process of dehumanization was relentless. From the moment prisoners were tattooed with identification numbers, their names ceased to exist. SS officers and capos rarely used words like man or woman. Instead, they referred to prisoners as Stücke, pieces. So striped uniforms replaced personal clothing, making everyone look the same, stripping away identity and pride. Heads were shaved bald, robbing people of the smallest markers of individuality. For many, the psychological impact was devastating. Who were they now without a name, without possessions, without even hair? Cruelty extended beyond physical punishment. Humiliation was a weapon used daily. Prisoners were forced to perform meaningless tasks, like scrubbing floors with bare hands, singing Nazi songs while marching, or standing naked during inspections in the freezing cold. Women were often targeted for particular degradation, mocked, beaten, and sometimes assaulted by guards. These acts were not random. They were calculated to break spirits. And then came the medical experiments, a chapter of horror that defies comprehension. In Auschwitz, Dr. Josef Mengele became infamous for his twisted studies, particularly on twins. Children were injected with chemicals, subjected to surgeries without anesthesia, and mutilated in the name of pseudoscience. Other doctors experimented with sterilization methods, freezing endurance, and infectious diseases. Prisoners were deliberately infected with typhus or tuberculosis, then observed as they wasted away. Survival was rare, and for those who did live, the scars, physical and emotional, never healed. One of the most grotesque experiments involved testing the limits of human endurance. Prisoners were submerged in icy water to study hypothermia, or placed in pressure chambers until their lungs collapsed. Eyes were injected with dyes to attempt artificial color changes. These atrocities were carried out under the guise of medical progress, but in reality, they were acts of sadism cloaked in scientific language. For those not selected for experiments, the psychological terror was no less severe. Random executions kept fear ever present. A prisoner caught stealing food might be hanged before the entire camp as a warning. Others were chosen at random to be shot or sent to the gas chambers. The unpredictability was part of the torment. Death could come at any moment, for any reason, or for no reason at all. The crematoria loomed as a constant reminder of fate. Black smoke curled into the sky day and night, carrying the smell of burning flesh. Everyone knew what it meant, though few dared to speak of it aloud. Rumors of gas chambers circulated, but new arrivals often clung to disbelief. Hope was a fragile thing, and acknowledging the truth was too heavy to bear for some. Suicide became a quiet act of resistance for those who could endure no more. Many ran into electrified fences, ending their suffering in an instant. Others starved themselves intentionally. In a world stripped of control, death on one's own terms was, for some, the only remaining choice. Yet in the midst of this manufactured hell, flickers of humanity persisted. A whispered word of comfort, a crust of bread secretly shared, a prayer muttered under breath. These small acts were lifelines. They defied the Nazi goal of total dehumanization. Survivors would later say that these moments, though rare, gave them strength to continue when everything else urged them to surrender. The psychological toll was staggering. Many emerged from the camps as shadows of themselves, haunted by memories that would never fade. Trust, love, faith, everything was tested and often shattered. For some, the war ended, but the inner battle raged on for the rest of their lives. In the camps, survival was not measured by strength alone, but by sheer chance, and by the fragile threads of humanity that refused to break, even in the darkest place on earth. By late 1944, the tide of war had turned. The Allies were advancing from the west, and the Soviet Red Army was closing in from the east. The Nazi regime, determined to erase evidence of its crimes, began evacuating concentration camps in a desperate attempt to hide the horrors within. What followed was one of the most brutal chapters of the Holocaust, the death marches. These forced evacuations began in the harshest conditions imaginable: deep winter, snow blanketing the ground, temperatures plunging far below freezing. Thousands of prisoners, skeletal from starvation, were ordered to march for miles on end, with little food, no proper clothing, and almost no rest. They were driven forward at gunpoint, boots crunching on ice, lungs burning from the cold. For many, the march was a death sentence, even before it began. The SS offered no mercy. Anyone who stumbled or slowed down risked being shot on the spot. The roads became lined with corpses, frozen in unnatural positions. Some prisoners collapsed from exhaustion and begged for a bullet to end their suffering. Others simply lay down in the snow, letting the cold claim them. For those who tried to help a fallen comrade, the punishment was often immediate death. Compassion itself became dangerous. The marches were not short journeys. Some lasted days, others weeks, covering distances of 50 to 500 kilometers. Prisoners wore thin striped uniforms, their feet wrapped in rags or wooden clogs that splintered and tore at the skin. Frostbite blackened fingers and toes, and infection spread quickly. Those who survived the first day often wondered if survival was even worth the agony that followed. Food was nearly non-existent. Occasionally, guards tossed scraps of bread or thin soup at night, but these rations were deliberately insufficient. Some prisoners ate snow to quench their thirst, despite knowing it would worsen their weakness. Starvation gnawed at them like a living thing. The few who still had strength scavenged for anything edible: frozen roots and discarded potato skins, even dead animals found along the way. Nights offered no relief. Prisoners were often forced to sleep in open fields or barns, huddled together for warmth. Many froze to death during these nights, their bodies stiff by morning. The moans of the dying filled the darkness, blending with the howls of distant dogs and the occasional crack of a gunshot. Hope, for most, became a distant memory. The SS guards were ruthless, but some were drunk with power and cruelty. They mocked the prisoners, forced them to sing while marching, or beat them for amusement. For others, the brutality seemed mechanical, a job carried out without emotion. Either way, the result was the same: a trail of death that marked the final retreat of the Nazi Empire. The marches were not just about hiding evidence, they were about continuing the system of destruction. Camps like Auschwitz, Majdanek, and Stutthof were emptied as the front lines closed in. Prisoners were moved to camps deeper inside Germany: Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, places already overwhelmed with the dying. Disease spread like wildfire in these overcrowded facilities, claiming thousands even after the marches ended. Eyewitness accounts describe roads littered with bodies, villages echoing with the sound of boots and cries of despair. Local civilians sometimes watched in silence. Others offered scraps of food at great personal risk. A few joined in the cruelty, emboldened by years of Nazi propaganda. The world outside the barbed wire was no guarantee of safety. For those who survived the marches and reached another camp, what awaited them was often worse than what they had left behind. Barracks overflowed, water was contaminated, and disease claimed lives faster than bullets. In Bergen-Belsen alone, Tens of thousands died in the final months before liberation, their bodies piled in mass graves or left rotting in the open. And yet, amid this landscape of death, some clung to life with a determination that defied comprehension. They whispered to themselves, just one more day, one more hour. They thought of family, of home, of a world beyond the horror. For some, that fragile hope carried them through to liberation. For others, the last steps they took were on frozen roads, their bodies abandoned to the snow. The death marches were the Nazis' final act of cruelty, a desperate, murderous attempt to keep their victims within reach until the very end. For those who survived, the ordeal would remain etched in memory as one of the darkest episodes of human history. Liberation, a word that should mean joy, relief, and hope, came to the concentration camps like a distant, flickering light. For the prisoners who had endured months or years of starvation, disease, and brutality, freedom did not arrive with cheering crowds or celebrations. It came quietly, often against a backdrop of death, despair, and disbelief. In January 1945, the Soviet Red Army reached the gates of Auschwitz, the largest of the Nazi killing centers. They found a place that defied comprehension. Mountains of shoes, glasses, and human hair, silent evidence of millions murdered. Scattered across the camp were skeletal survivors, too weak to stand, staring at their liberators with hollow eyes. Some crawled toward the soldiers, others simply lay motionless, unsure if they were dreaming. For many, the war was over, but the struggle to survive was far from finished. Similar scenes unfolded across Europe as Allied forces pushed into German-occupied territory. In Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, and countless other camps, soldiers encountered sights that would haunt them forever. Barracks overflowing with corpses, piles of unburied dead, and living prisoners so emaciated they seemed barely human. The stench of decay clung to the air, mingling with smoke from crematoria that had burned day and night. The soldiers were unprepared for what they saw. Hardened by years of combat, many wept openly as they entered the camps. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, after visiting Ohrdruf, insisted that the atrocities be documented. He ordered photographs and films to be taken, fearing that one day people might deny what had happened. His words proved prophetic. For the survivors, liberation was not an instant transformation. Some were too sick to celebrate. Diseases like typhus and dysentery spread rapidly in the chaotic aftermath, killing thousands even after the gates were opened. In Bergen-Belsen, more than 13,000 prisoners died in the weeks following liberation, their bodies unable to recover from months of deprivation. Medical teams worked tirelessly, but resources were limited, and for many, help came too late. Hunger remained a deadly enemy. Liberators shared rations, but rich food after long starvation often killed those who ate too quickly. Doctors had to impose strict diets to avoid refeeding syndrome, a condition that claimed countless lives in those first, fragile days of freedom. The irony was unbearable: to survive the camp, only to die after liberation. Psychological wounds ran even deeper. Prisoners had lost everything: families, homes, communities. Many learned that parents, spouses, and children had been murdered in gas chambers or perished in other camps. The weight of grief was crushing. Some survivors felt numb, unable to imagine a future. Others were consumed by guilt for living when so many had died. This torment became known as survivor's guilt, a burden carried silently for decades. Returning to a normal life was nearly impossible. Homes had been destroyed, property stolen, and entire communities wiped out. Many survivors had nowhere to go. Displaced persons, DAP camps, were established to shelter them temporarily, but these camps could not erase the trauma of the past. For some, emigration offered hope. Thousands eventually built new lives in the United States, Israel, and other countries. But the shadows of the camps followed them forever. The world, too, struggled to comprehend the scale of the horror. The Nuremberg trials began in 1945, bringing Nazi leaders to justice for crimes against humanity. Testimonies from survivors and liberators revealed details so shocking that even hardened war correspondents wept. Terms like genocide and Holocaust entered the global vocabulary, forever marking the atrocities as a warning to future generations. And yet, despite the overwhelming evidence, denial would later emerge. For this reason, survivors felt an urgent duty to speak. They told their stories in courtrooms, classrooms, and books, ensuring that the truth could never be erased. Their voices, fragile but unyielding, became a testament to resilience. Liberation was not an ending. It was the beginning of a lifelong struggle to heal, to remember, and to rebuild. For many, freedom felt unreal, haunted by nightmares that did not vanish with the barbed wire. But it was also a triumph, however small, the survival of life and memory against a regime that sought to erase both. Today, when we hear the word liberation, we imagine joy. But in the camps of 1945, liberation was something far more complex, a mixture of relief, grief, and the dawning question of what it meant to live again after so much had been lost.